Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy, and I am one of the science communication interns here at the Cal Academy as a part of the SSI program. This is our very first episode of our live stream series titled Live with the SSI Interns, where we interview members of our SSI cohort. To provide a little bit of background about our program, SSI stands for Summer Systematics Institute, and this is an REU, or Research Experience for Undergrads program funded by the National Science Foundation. With the exception of myself and another SciComm intern, all of our other interns work with curators or cure adjacent staff members here at the California Academy of Sciences. As we continue with this broadcast, feel free to leave comments or questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the very end as the discussion unfolds. And without further ado, I'm super excited to introduce you all to our very first intern who's joining us, Lillie. So Lillie, would you like to share your hometown, pronouns, home institution, and anything else that you would like the audience to know?
Sure thing. I guess first and foremost, apologies for my hair. It's always just kind of a little bit in a messy state. But I'm Lillie. I use they, them pronouns. I am from Southern California, Thousand Oaks, roughly, if anybody knows about it. And I go to Oregon State University, and I study botany. And that's what I'm doing here at the California Academy of Sciences. I am working in Dr. Sarah Jacobs' lab with postdoc Adriana Hernandez, and we'll talk more about it as we get into it. But yeah, that's thrilled to be here, thrilled to be the first.
Yep, awesome. Well, we're super excited to have you as our very first intern. Thank you for agreeing to be our guinea pig. But with that, we'll go ahead and just sort of jump into our core questions for this live stream. So our very first question for you is, how would you explain your summer research project to a fifth grader?
This was a great question for me to think about, because I don't know the last time I have spoken to a fifth grader. So I was really like, I don't really remember what fifth graders know, but I think they know more than I was originally giving them credit for. So what I'm doing this summer is working on a group of flowers called paintbrushes. You see them a lot of the time all along the coast of California, but all across the state. And there's a bunch of different species within this flower group. Now, flowers have a lot of different pieces. They're not just the petals or the leaves. There's a bunch of other reproductive structures and parts in that. And so I'm going to be using a lot of those pieces, like the petals, to see how the species are similar or different from each other. So we're just taking the flowers that we find in the wild, we're putting them in basically a printer scanner, and getting really nice pictures. And from that, I am making outlines of these flower structures the flower that we're dissecting in the field. And I'm putting it into a computer program, and we're going to see what the computer says with my help, telling it which way to be computing about how similar or dissimilar these species are from one another.
That was awesome. I've never taken a botany class, and that was super easy to follow. So hopefully if there are any fifth graders in the crowd, they also followed along.
Yeah, hopefully, please tell me, fifth graders, if that went well.
Well, that was great. And obviously, as I mentioned, sort of most of our interns here are working directly with scientists and PIs and their labs to do research like your own. But I'm just sort of curious, what did you think research was before? Like, what did it look like to you before you either entered this internship or any other research experience that you've had prior to this?
For sure. So I started, I used to be an English major circa 2018 when I first started college. I was an English major. And so the idea of research at that point was a super different thing. I imagined research in the terms of the medical field and lab coats, which I've never worn a lab coat in any lab that I've worked at over the past couple of years. But I've never worked in like a medical field where they're a lot more common, so I hear. And I think I just imagined research as this far away thing that wasn't tangible to me. And even when I started becoming, quote unquote, a scientist or interested in science, it was still kind of this thing that I think I imagined it would be super duper glamorous, mad scientist. Even within botany, I think thought I might be moving around genomes within plants or creating, these glow in the dark types of things, which is not what I'm interested at all in whatsoever, and not what most people do in the lab. So I imagined it was this almost like a more glamorous thing, I guess. What it's actually become, or what I've actually experienced it as, is doing research is not just doing research. It is also a lot of writing for grants, or writing the results, or writing proposal for all sorts of things. So it's organizing people as well. If you're leading research, you're doing all sorts of things other than just being in the field or being in the lab. It's all the little pieces that really come together to make what research is, which was an interesting shift away from what I had previously thought. And sometimes it feels as if you have to frequently recontextualize and remind yourself what you're doing, of what you're doing towards the larger goal. Because I could be sitting here for hours just like cropping these pictures of flower parts and be like, okay, well, oh my gosh, what am I doing? But once I remind myself, like, this is the greater project and why the results are actually going to be super engaging and exciting, and it's all going to be worth it in the end. In the moment, it can be difficult, but at the end of any project, it's so great to just finally have the work done. So.
Yeah, that was awesome. I sort of similar, we've talked about this. I come from more of a humanities background, and so research in that field looks very different to the science research that you and the other interns are doing. And I loved how you sort of looked at the bigger picture and brought in all of these other aspects of research that I think especially those who are early in their careers, like they're not writing grants and they're not necessarily writing up the results. And so the fact that it's really this much longer and more complicated process than just getting to do the DNA analysis or be out in the field. I think that's a really great insight that you just shared with all of our audience members. So thank you so much for that. And you had sort of briefly touched on sort of what you thought research would look like prior to sort of now, quote unquote, becoming a scientist. And I'm just curious if you feel like you are a scientist and what that sort of means for you to potentially be at that place where you're like, hey, like I'm doing science, like I'm creating knowledge. I'm not just an undergrad who's interested, or I'm not just somebody who does this as a hobby.
I think I should have thought about this more in advance, but you've kind of like spurred another question. What I have written down, because we were doing these questions and I was putting it together, piecing it together. If you have questions and you do something to test them, you're a scientist. But the question that raised for me, and it still raises for me, when we were out on our field week, I was talking to somebody as we were walking, like, I don't really feel comfortable calling myself a botanist. I think you're a scientist when you do any of these things, when you think in a scientific way. But for me, my comfort in calling myself a botanist, when there's so many botanists out there who know like thousands of different species of plants and I'm nowhere on their level yet. I think that's always a constant struggle between calling yourself a scientist or a botanist and never being able to reach these unattainable goals, or looking to somebody who's 50 years into their career and assuming that you have to be on the same level to consider yourself the same thing. But it totally isn't. If you think in a scientific way, I think you could be considered a scientist. I wasn't interested in science growing up because I, at the beginning, was really interested in the humanities. But I got into plants just as like, I think it started with houseplants, and then it just kind of all spiraled from there. And that's kind of when I realized a lot of what I had grown up with is science adjacent. I'm just thinking back now on the limited science classes that I did take and how they did kind of form me, even though my focus all that time was humanities. It was kind of there all the time. Yeah, I started growing plants and that was about it. But I think even within the humanities, there's plenty of room to be a scientist or to employ scientific thinking within those disciplines. It's really just the way I see it is that science, super broadly, is this study of mostly tangible things. I'll put a little asterisk there because science is also lots of asterisks. Whereas humanity might be more engaged with the abstract and these ideas. While there's definitely overlap between the two of them, I think that's generally the way that I think of them. And so science is just this way of understanding physical things. And you can totally employ that way of thinking in the humanities. I think I'm rambling a bit too much in like the philosophical, which is where the English major definitely comes into play. But there's absolutely, when you're writing a literature paper, you're just using evidence to support claims that you have. And kind of at the end of the day, that's what a lot of science is looking to do, to find evidence to support some ideas that we have. So science is all the time.
Yeah, no, that was really, really great. I liked how you started off by framing it as, doing science is asking questions and being curious and then going out and figuring out the answers. And I think with that, like, really sort of baseline description of what science is, then I think science is very intrinsic to humans as a whole, because that's sort of what we're always doing is we have curiosities and we're trying to figure things out, and then we go out and discover all of these things about the natural world or about, other subjects. And so I think that was really great, and also totally share the sentiment that I think the humanities and the sciences can go hand in hand, and they're not two completely distinct disciplines that have nothing to do with one another. So our very next question, this was sort of created in the framework that I think for me personally growing up, I always thought that science was very sterile, very impersonal. It was very much about like objective truth, and that there was no space really within that framework to imbue your sense of self or your identity into your work. And so I always thought that those two things were very separate. But I think that sort of culture is changing a little bit. And I think especially here at the Academy, I've heard and been a part of a lot of conversations that fundamentally sort of ask this question of how does your personal identity inform your science?
Yeah, so the two largest identities that I resonate with are being queer, being neurodivergent, and I think that they both interact with the way I perform science pretty dramatically. I'm still figuring out how the queer one interacts with sciences, because there's this huge movement that's been around for a really long time with the idea of queering nature and the way that queer people interact with nature, whether that be in farming. I know it's a pretty big deal in farming and agriculture specifically. And I'm trying to put that in context of scientific research. It feels a lot more difficult for me to piece these two things together, because there is this kind of, like you were saying, this sterileness that comes with the scientific environment. So to think of my discipline through this lens of queer ecology, and there's so many theorists, which this is where humanities and science come into play. There's so much theory behind queer ecology and the way that we interact with the environment. I'm still working on how this will work in like a professional research type setting, because I think a lot of the concept behind queering nature, queering ecology comes from a place of connection and being non-traditional and kind of breaking rules, when science is oftentimes about breaking rules, but when it comes to the industry or the professionalism of it, it does like its rules. So we're still working on that one. I think the neurodivergence is a lot more, maybe less understood societally, but it is a lot better to deal with in science. It just helps me think of things in a much different way than other people might be thinking about problems or solutions, which is so beneficial for science. And I know that a lot of identities across the broad spectrum of whatever they might be, when people think differently, you're able to think of different solutions, which are oftentimes, the more precise or accurate ones to whatever the problem might be. So these I wouldn't be able to do anything, I don't think, without involving my identity in some way, shape, or form. And I don't want to. I don't think anybody, it's a personal thing. If you would like to separate the two, absolutely, power to you, whatever you need to do to make yourself feel comfortable. I think that I encourage, as many people who want to. I think it makes any work in any discipline just even stronger and more authentic. And I think that that's, in order to keep progressing in any field, I think that that's what we need, is these new diverse perspectives.
And then
That's awesome. And I completely agree. I think diversity has been shown, through research to really impact the amount of sort of novel thinking, creative thinking that I think a lot of our current challenges really require. So sort of our last planned question before we get to the ones that are in the chat. This was a fun bonus question. It's just, what is your biggest science hot take?
I'll go to that in 1 second, but you did bring up the word diversity, and I think I had just like skirted around it, or maybe I did say it, but the key, especially when I think, again, thinking about things in an ecological perspective, is diversity of any ecosystem is what keeps it afloat. It is just so integral to the lasting success of the communities, having diverse anything, the number of species or the number of different groups that you have in ecological systems. So really, I can't stress enough like the diversity of scientists, just from like if you're looking at a scientific group from an ecological perspective, if one group is not doing well in one thing, then you definitely need to have others to obtain the same goals and to support everybody. So just wanted to reiterate that point because the word came up, and I love it when science connects with social constructs. My biggest science hot take, I don't necessarily have any things I don't have any genomes to trash on or DNA or anything like that. But I do have some pretty hot takes when it comes to traditional horticulture and gardening in general. I'm a very big bamboo fan, and that's kind of scandalous for a lot of horticulturalists who know that plant is just like, oh my God, my neighbor planted bamboo. It spreads everywhere all the time through these rhizomes. It's impossible to get out. Which I totally agree with, can absolutely be a nuisance that can be applied to any plant whatsoever. But I think it's just such a neat thing. I think there's a couple, not in California, I don't think, but the North America has a couple native bamboo species, which is super cool. But bamboo in general is just this really fast growing and strong building material. So I feel like we've kind of underutilized that industry so far. And also horticulturally, it's just gorgeous, just like a bamboo forest, not loving the monoculture of it, but at the same time, these ecosystems naturally exist. So very fun. I could talk for so long about other plants that I really like that other people don't for one reason or another. People get really up in arms for botany and gardening and horticulture in general. People have very strong opinions. I think you're allowed to have opinions, but also realize these are plants. They don't matter that much. They matter a whole bunch, but whether or not you like a certain one is just kind of neither here nor there. They're there, and your opinion's not going to change whether or not they're there. So.
That was really cool. I didn't know that horticulturalists and people interested in botany were that passionate about their favorite plants. But that was great. Those are sort of all of the questions that we had pre-prepared, but there are a couple in the chat. So pulling from the chat, David Case.
That's so exciting.
I know.
Oh, hi, Dad. That's my dad.
Oh, hi, Lillie's dad. So your dad asked, what is your dream research project if you had unlimited resources?
Oh my gosh, my dad's asking me a science question. I feel like the one that maybe he and a lot of other people, when you think about botanists, is you think about, oh, the Martian, let's go to the moon or let's go to Mars, let's plant potatoes. I'm not necessarily interested in that kind of stuff from a professional perspective. Super cool though, props on anybody doing that kind of stuff. I'm very interested these days in, I think prairies are what I would like to focus my botanical research on, as I'm really into prairies and the remnant landscapes that we have in North America and the way that they're declining and the way that they're not only declining, but evolving. So I'm a flower person, which means I don't think I'm ever going to get as much support as crops do, which is for a valid reason. People need these things to eat. At the same time, these flowers are super duper important to the health of the ecosystems, which again, if you have healthy ecosystems surrounding urban centers, those centers will be all the better off in the long run. So I think if I had unlimited, oh my gosh, resources, there's so many things I could do. I would choose at the moment to stay in the floristic province of North America. I really like the flora here, and I really think there is a lot of work to be done to strengthen the ecosystems that we have and to to keep as much of what we're losing and to help not only just protecting what we're losing, but to modify existing landscapes to make them more beneficial for the future.
Awesome. Also, to Lily's dad, thank you for the houseplants you sent. Lily's been very good in sharing them with all of the housemates, so we've been enjoying them. Okay, so we have another question from Jojo C, who asks, what is a mind-blowing fact about plants that people may not know?
Ooh, there's so many. One that kind of blew my mind recently, and this might just be a me thing, is that there's different methods that plants have for photosynthesis, and to perform them differently. I'm not going to be able to explain it as beautifully and eloquently, as somebody who spends their life studying C4 plants. But if you're interested in the different types of photosynthesis that plants do, it's C4 and CAM plants are the smaller group. So people spend their whole lives trying to modify crops to do this type of photosynthesis because it's more efficient, and helps the plant grow stronger with less nutrients. So that's super cool. I also recently found out that some plants will have little windows, like succulents. Some specific types of succulent plants will have little windows at the top so that it kind of funnels the sunlight to the bottom of the plant where it's cooler. Just little things like that are just so smart and intuitive that you're just like, nature made this up on its own, and that's just so fantastic and awesome that it works so intuitively. Raphides are also a really interesting thing, which is just plants will have shards of crystals within their tissues sometimes, and that's entirely a defense-based thing, and they're called raphides. So if something bites into it, they'll be like, oh my gosh, there's this sharp crystal inside of it. I don't want to eat it anymore. That's super cool. There's just so many things. Every day I learn something new that plants do that kind of blows my mind. So
That was super cool. I feel like every time I learn any type of biofact, I'm reminded about the fact that nature is just absolutely wild and a little bit mental. And I think especially with plants, I usually think of them as like very sedentary, like, I don't know, they don't really move. They don't necessarily like attack in the way that sort of fauna will do, but it's really cool to hear that like actually they have all these really awesome defense mechanisms and other structures that help them survive, because nature is, again, super crazy, but super smart.
If I can add in super fast also about plants not moving. I mean, just because it's so interesting to me, there are some plants that have the like, that you touch it and it's like this instant curl up response. But I plug for my favorite botanical podcast. There's so many I listen to, but plug right now specifically for In Defense of Plants. They had an episode that I listened to, a year ago that changed my mind about tree migration. It's like plants might not move, but their offspring move. And in doing that, they can move basically a continuation of the same individual hundreds of miles, and which is what we're seeing so often, not just because of climate change, but that's a major driving force behind it. So just every day it's something new, something cool. Plants are moving, plants are migrating. Isn't that crazy? Anyway.
Yeah, super awesome. And I'll have to get your other podcast recs later today. But just one last quick question before we sort of conclude this live stream. Cass is asking, what is the strangest plant you've ever encountered in your studies? And then there's a smiley face.
Thank you for the smiley face and the question. There are really weird plants. And that's saying a lot because I'm somebody who's interested in North American flora specifically. So there's the whole tropics and neotropics that I really don't know that much about. And the tropics are just these hot spots for speciation and diversification. So there are things that are just beyond anything you can imagine. I think a lot of people know of like the big stinky flowers that are native to a lot of tropical regions. There's multiple ways that like big stinky flowers have evolved, different, like unrelated to each other. So stuff like that is always fascinating. Carnivorous plants are always fascinating. For me, being somebody who's really interested in flowers, every time I find a new flower that has some structure that I've never seen before, I just get super in awe of that. So a lot of Fabaceae or legumes or pea type plants have a specific structure that they're closed up until the pollinator comes. And just anything where the flower has like a snapping mechanism or just some kind of like explosion that happens a lot in Brassica too, is the seeds will explode. And that stuff is just crazy to me, the methods of dispersal. As far as like, I have so many crazy looking plants. One of my favorite ornamental plants is called Edgeworthia. I think it's the common name is like the Chinese paper bush. And it's this nice big bush during most of, the season. But during the winter, the end of winter, beginning of spring is right when it flowers. And just these gorgeous little flowers. They smell so beautiful. And there's no leaves on it whatsoever. So it's just this crazy, like alien Dr. Seuss looking tree that happens. It's not a tree, it's a bush. And that's a whole separate conversation. The distinction between those two. But honestly, just I can find something alien and bizarre in pretty much any flower, at the very least, the family.
Cool. Well, that sort of wraps up our live stream for today. Thank you so much, Lillie, for joining us and for being our very first intern. You were awesome to interview. Before we officially end, for those of you who are watching, we'd like to encourage you to follow our social media channels on Instagram and Twitter, which just appeared on the banner and on the screen. So you can join us virtually on all of our adventures this summer, both with Lillie and the other interns. And then lastly, tune in today at 2:35 p.m. to listen to our next interview with Nellie. And yeah, with that, I hope everybody has a great day.
Awesome. Thank you.